This episode is sponsored by Naraka Blade Point, whose new character Takeda is playable now.
With Naraka Blade Point releasing a new character, Takeda, it gives us a great opportunity to actually do another historical build and make the Kabuto samurai helmet. From my understanding, most helmets and most armor, when they're made out of metal, in Japan, utilized iron. Although there's some research that says what we used to think is iron was steel, and then there's a separate question, which one was heat treated, which one was not. The question of heat treating is actually ubiquitous in studying armor, as well as in the West, Middle East, Japan, China, and so on. So I'm not going to dwell on it. So in our case, I took, as a good replacement for iron, we took mild steel. It is easy to work with and is a good functional representation of what a helmet should be. To make a decent historical helmet that is at the same time fitting to the new character Takeda in the game, I'm choosing to make the bowl out of 5 parts. The visor, the central piece, 2 sides, and a band that goes around here. Every single one of those parts has a comparable Japanese name, and later on I will mention them. I start out by cutting out the pattern and dishing them, constantly checking whether the pieces start slowly matching to each other. The sizing on helmets is always a complicated issue for an armor because helmets are usually made to a specific person. I'm making mine based off of my size and then adding 2 sizes. That way I assume that most people will be able to try it on at some point. In all my years doing swords and armor and jewelry, I've never actually made a true representation of a samurai helmet. And this will be my first opportunity. One of the ways one begins to make a samurai helmet is by examining a bunch of antiques. And to appreciate the true beauty of this specific art form, the antiques themselves are a good start into understanding which parts were made at what time and how to categorize samurai helmets. Like anything Japanese, it is extremely complicated, specific, subtle, and deep into tradition. For this build, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the English terminology for parts that have an English equivalent, unless otherwise is necessary. But parts that do not have a true parallel in the English language or in the West, I'm going to use Japanese terminology. And the reason for that is not only my pronunciation in Japanese is terrible, but also the viewer can become lost if I just start dumping terminology without a good reference. If you are a collector of Japanese antiques and want to buy a samurai helmet, Kabuto, the most important part is the helmet bowl, the hachi. That is the only piece on a samurai helmet that is actually authenticated and appraised in its own right. All that other garniture is usually done by separate people, so you might buy a very fancy Japanese helmet, but have it be appraised at a low price because the maker of just the bowl was not a very famous maker. Very early Japanese helmets in the Heian period and before were most of the times made from a solid piece of metal. I'm skipping the Bronze Age period too, although Japanese armor from the Bronze Age period looks suspiciously similar to Greek. Convergent evolution. Later, during the Warring States period, it became apparent that manufacturing iron helmets would have been easier out of multiple pieces, because it's easier to shape a series of pieces and then attach them than to shape one piece. Also, it is possible that a lamellar construction or series of riveted pieces was more durable than a solid helmet, because the rivets create a sort of spring-like action, and the space between the pieces, once it starts getting loosening up, acts kind of like a shock absorption. But that is neither here nor there. When you look at all samurai armor in general, they're very usually covered with thick layers of lacquer, to the point that it's very difficult to tell whether the armor you're looking at is made out of iron, steel, leather, or paper. The reasoning for the lacquer is because the geography of Japan is such that it is an island that experiences tremendous climatological shift from north to south. It has very high humidity and has half a season of monsoons. And any iron armor needs to be protected. So most Japanese antique helmets are painted with a series of body fills, which is clay and lacquer, with a finer lacquer on top. This very principle actually influenced the production of modern cars, where you see a car having body fill and then very nice gloss paint over it. The purpose of the paint is not only for the car to look nice, but primarily to protect the metal parts underneath. And such was the manufacturing theory already in the 10th century in Japan. After all the parts are roughly shaped together, I put in temporary rivets in order to put the pieces together and base the next piece and the next piece and the next piece off of what I already have. The reason for that being I don't actually have a set of patterns for making a Japanese helmet, so I'm developing a vocabulary of shapes, patterns, and references as I go, which I will later be able to use on some other samurai helmet, if I so choose. Funny enough, with the addition of a menpo mask, that is this thing that protects your face, which is very prominent in samurai helmets and perhaps are some of the most attractive pieces for a collector. The entire structure of the given helmet that we have is kind of an inside-out version of an articulated sallet. Think about it. You have the helmet, you have the brim, which I will add later, and then you have the bever that is articulated here, like this. So essentially, the function of the Kabuto helmet that we have here will be identical to that of a Western sallet, and it is useful to think about how the helmet will operate in actual combat if you have an experience with Western German armor. Once the helmet ball is roughly put together, I start on the menpo mask. The reason why I don't complete the entire helmet and then start the menpo mask is because the menpo mask is more exciting to make, and the rest of the helmet besides the bowl is very tedious and exhausting, so I want to entertain myself just a little bit. The structure of the Japanese menpo mask is very often quite interesting. It is not made from a solid piece. What you have is the part of the mask that protects your jawline and cheekbones. And then the nose is a separate piece that is removable. Often enough, if you look at menpo masks, they have a series of hooks or turns or something that attaches and locks it in. So it's possible to wear the mask with the nose in, which gives you a little bit more vision, much more breathability, or if you want to protect your face a little bit more, you just clip it on and there you go. It is very difficult to achieve the necessary shape that is required to represent Takeda's character from the game, as well as any traditional menpo mask, without using hot work. I'm sure someone can do it. I'd rather move metal while it's hot rather than while it's cold. I work on the nose as well as the rest of the menpo mask simultaneously because that's the best way of achieving a good fit. Remember, I have to have the locking mechanism operate fairly easily in order to be able to remove or attach the nose at my convenience. In the game, as well as very commonly in Mempo masks in general, what the face that you see is a representation of an Oni, or an ogre demon. Oni are not indigenous to Japan and arrived from the continent around the 10th or 9th century, thereabout, and evolved into an Oni god sort of devil figure that does not perform the purpose of a devil in the West, but is more likely to be described as the guardian of hell and the devourer of sinners. So Oni is like a force of nature in now Buddhist theology and performs his necessary function. There are other mythological instances of Oni, the troll under the bridge, so to speak, those kind of fairy tales. But I assume when we're dealing with armor that we have a representation of a Buddhist version of the Oni rather than a mere folk fairy tale. Just like in the source material, specifically the helmet from the game, Oni are characterized with big tusks or teeth, and the bigger teeth will be added later to the Mempo masks as a separate riveted on piece. However, some of the teeth will be already present in the first layer of sheet metal that I'm utilizing. In order to attach the fold part of the bever, and I switch my terminology on purpose here, I have to introduce a separate piece right here that bends out and allows for the riveting of the first plate to which the subsequent plates will be laced. The lacing of the plates might appear weird to someone who likes Western armor, but remember, these silk strings are virtually identical to the leather straps that you see on the inside of Western armor whenever you see articulation. And in fact, silk within the first 5 years of its use tends to be more durable than leather because it responds to humidity much better, as well as it responds to cuts and slices much better than leather does. In all honesty, the parts of the Japanese armor and how they truly functions are fairly speculative at this point. And that has to do a lot with the history of Japan. In 1603, Tokugawa takes entire control of Japan and there is no more actual war. Armor is still being used, but from then on, armor itself becomes a matter of expression of the samurai spirit and acquires a little bit more of a theatrical nature. As a result, manuals on armor wearing and armor use fall into the same category as martial arts in general. They become more ritualized, they become more sophisticated in the sense that they are an expression of the sophistication of the noble class, and no longer are as much attached to practical necessity. That makes armor much more ostentatious, but to the martial arts researcher it does a disservice in the sense that it's very difficult to find sources on how each part truly operated and how effective it was to begin with. Now that the exciting part of the helmet is done, it's time to make the shakuro, or the articulating folds that protect your neck and back of the head. They're characterized by a very interesting feature that is not found in Western armor, and that is called the fukigaeshi. And these are the folds that look very weird to the Western eye, that roll up right here, and often enough they have some artistic depiction over here that has either heraldic or an honorary sort of purpose. However, the martial purpose of these pieces, supposedly, is to protect the wearer's eyes from arrows. I suppose the way they work is by either tipping your head down and they would catch the arrow that would otherwise somehow fall in here, or they can operate very much like in modern military arms where armies attach random garbage to armored vehicles to make sure that there is some sort of interaction between the projectile and the actual body armor of the vehicle. Usually in modern warfare, those are designed to prevent explosives from interacting with the armor. However, if you're a martial arts practitioner, think about it. When you're placing a precise cut on something, your brain calculates the point of contact. When there's a visual distraction some distance away from your intended target, you miscut, and all this trash prevents you from cutting properly on the helmet. So it is exactly like cutting through brush. One very spectacular aspect of Japanese helmets is the datemono, mon, the family or army crest that is attached as a separate piece to the helmet. The way it is attached is through a hook called Haraidate, and the mon or datemono is usually made from either paper, wood, or light, soft sheet metal. All in all, it's very similar to the way heraldic sculpture is attached to Western helmets for the purpose of tournaments. Remember, those are usually made out of wood as well. Our viewer, you, should keep in mind, although this video takes about 20 plus minutes, the making of the actual helmet took me about a month, give or take couple days, and that month was entirely submerged in work. Once the mask is fully shaped, and before it has been patinaed, and before any of the silk is being attached to it, it's time to make the brass accents that go onto it, especially the decorative chin strap ring that goes right here. In order to do that, I cut out the brass with a jeweler saw and start bending it directly over the mask. Remember, there's no special surface treatment to the mask yet, and I can use it as if it were one of my raising stakes. Now that the entire mask is done, it's time to lace on all the folds or scales. For that I use silk wrap and very carefully, not trying to disrupt the silk, tie on every single piece. And altogether, at the very end, it creates a very nice, flexible, and at the same time, strong construction. During the aforementioned Edo period, Japan also encounters an influx of Western influence. And often enough in museums or exhibitions, you would see a Western helmet, like a Morion, with all the Japanese stuff attached to it, but the skull cap is clearly Western. Or you will see a peacock-breasted breastplate with all the lamellar scales still attached to it on top to make it look more Japanese. Now, this phenomenon of Japanizing Western armor is actually present and reverted back onto Japanese indigenous armor itself. There are some examples of armors that were thought to be fully leather, or they were thought to be made from lamellar, but X-ray analysis showed that what we thought was scales are actually straight bands with flutes that have been painted over in such a way to make them look like separate pieces, to make them look more like the old armor construction. Or you see in X-ray imaging pieces of armor that you would think are not metallic, but the critical areas where a hit would be more expected, or if most people are right-handed, meaning a hit to the left area will be generally stronger than to the right area, so all the right side of the armor in strategic spots is made out of iron or steel, but all the parts where apparently one was not expected to get hit very much are made out of lacquered leather. And from the outside, it's usually very difficult to tell because, as mentioned earlier, due to climatological reasons, Japanese were painting over their metal armor to begin with. That makes the art of armor and the approach to armor making completely different from the approach to blade making, where you expose as much as possible, but with armor you have the phenomenon of temple architecture being employed, where things are painted over and covered with successive layers of lacquer, gold leaf, and so on to create a sort of almost a paper or textile aesthetic look with horror vacuum, very busy surfaces that might even appear too flat to the Western eye. Well, this truly is my first samurai helmet. And after years of studying and honestly trying to be true to the source material, I'm quite certain that I did something wrong, or maybe everything wrong on this project. However, I would love to thank Naraka Blade Point for giving me the opportunity to try my best. Enjoy. This was a great historical project, my first samurai helmet, and if you have an idea for other historical, truly inspiring items you would like us to engage with, talk about, or build next, please leave a comment below. Like this video, share it if you can, and if you want more, check out some of the videos right here.